As football emerged, blinking from the period of forced suspension in the first lockdown, there were plenty of novelties to get used to. Stadiums without fans where you could hear the coach's instructions from the sidelines, commentators pausing their broadcast to answer their front doors, substitutes and officials wearing those ubiquitous masks. One sight during post-lockdown football which had nothing to do with the pandemic itself was that of players taking the knee before kick-off. Following on from the worldwide anti-racism protests that erupted after the murder of George Floyd, sport, and football in particular, was one of the first to take up the mantle. Taking the knee as a sign of protest was actually born in football, only the kind they play in America. NFL player Colin Kaepernick was the first to do so when he knelt during the US national anthem to draw awareness to police brutality and discrimination that is a daily occurrence in the States. However, it was in the oldest code of the game where the gesture began to generate serious traction on this side of the Atlantic, forcing the nation's favourite pastime to take a long, hard look at itself in the mirror. The history of racism in British football is long, winding and at times fractious. It's still in living memory when black players would routinely have to face a torrent of abuse from their own fans every time they set foot on the pitch. Although such overt racism in stadiums is largely a thing of the past, the advent of social media has allowed those who lowered their voices for fear of reprisal an avenue in which they can target their victims directly, invisibly, and too often inconsequentially. The situation can often be equally bleak in the mainstream media. You only have to compare the reactions to identical steps by white and black players. When Raheem Sterling buys a house for his mum, it's blinging, it's garish. He's a disgrace for such an expenditure when he should be monastically seeking penance for underperforming in an England shirt. When his teammate Phil Foden does exactly the same thing, he is a starlet who is setting up his future. I think at the root of much of it is fear of having our game stolen from us. England gave football to the world, it's true, but maybe we failed to say that there were strings attached after all. You can play the game, of course. You can change it, improve it, perfect it even. But whatever you do, you must behave appropriately, like a gentleman, like we do, in true Corinthian spirit. There's more than a little bit of cognitive dissonance going on here. I recently had personal experience of football's problem with racism in the lowest echelons of the game. During one of the rare occasions this year that I was able to play Saturday football, we were playing a match down in Croydon that was refereed by a black woman. Initially, I was buoyed by what I saw as progress. If something as entrenched as men's amateur football can be capable of this change, then maybe there is hope after all. But at the back of my mind, I was worried, especially against this team. And my fears were confirmed when late on in the game she was racially abused. A member of the opposing team shouted out bomboclaat in her direction. And that's a Jamaican patois term meaning a menstrual pad or toilet paper. The irony in all of this is that so many of our footballing heroes are black. The dividing line between someone receiving abuse and someone not receiving abuse is often so basic as the team that they play for. Tribalism, in other words, and cognitive dissonance again. So what can football do to eradicate this problem? In the short term, unquestionably, heavier punishments for offences. Lifetime bans for anyone found guilty of racism, anywhere, both in day-to-day society and online. Equally, for instances of racism by those playing, either professionally or at amateur level, the punishment needs to be more severe. To cite my example from above, I discovered that the player received a £60 fine and a 10-game ban, and I failed to see how the latter especially can actually be enforced. In the medium and longer term, more work needs to be done on inclusion and education. On the first point, more than a quarter of players at the top level of football in this country come from ethnic minorities. Yet when you continue upwards to administrative level, this ratio drops wildly. Those running the game need to represent and look like those who are playing it. On education is a word that gets mentioned a lot whenever this topic is brought up, but really I think it means spreading empathy or an understanding of the other's experience. Aston Villa defender Tyrone Mings, who suffered awful racial abuse on his England debut in Bulgaria, has spoken movingly on the necessity of sharing personal experiences. Racism is easier when it's abstract, when it's behind a computer screen. Opening a direct person-to-person dialogue would help to break that down. So, as we now enter a third national lockdown, footballers are, as before, continuing to take a knee before games so that the message does not drop out of public consciousness. Some from the black community, such as Queen's Park Rangers Director of Football Les Ferdinand, have questioned whether the gesture has lost its power and whether it should be discontinued. But for now, it's staying put after the Professional Footballers Association voted unanimously to continue the protest. Now, I wanted to end this speech on a more positive note and highlight the actions of a black English footballer who has rightfully been getting all the plaudits this year. Marcus Rashford, Mancunian to the bone, single-handedly managed to change government policy not to continue free school meals through lockdown by mobilising civil society and drawing on his own experiences as a child who had to rely on food banks. All the while, his performances on the pitch went from strength to strength. This admirable young man, unashamedly black, unashamedly English, serves as a role model for everyone, regardless of the colour of their skin. The hope is that Rashford and players like him can leave a lasting legacy on the game and even step into administrative or coaching positions once their careers are over. And more importantly, that there are no barriers to this, because this would deny football the input of a generation of intelligent young players whose diversity is their strength. And it would allow sport's true egalitarian values to flourish, where the only thing that matters is your ability.